Yeah, they got some. Yeah, Tom.
All right, you're finally ready. Thanks. Oh, sorry. We gotta get to the right slide. So, oh, maybe it's the okay. There we go. We need the introduction, and we need the screen on. Thanks all for coming and your patience as we try to set up. So now the live stream is hopefully working, and we can crack on. So I'm really pleased to be able to introduce you to Dr. Sara May, who was up earlier, so some of you have already heard her speak to the Cultural Heritage Management Masters students, and she kindly agreed to stay on to tell us about some of her fascinating research on the Heritage Futures project. I've known Sara for a while now. When previously she was at English Heritage, and before that doing other interesting things, including her PhD and such, and now is based at UCL, almost full-time working on the Heritage Futures project, and then also doing consultancy and interesting things on the side. I won't say anything more because I think we're going to hear all about her current research. So thank you so much, Sara, for joining us. And please come up.
Thanks very much, Sara. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming along, especially those of you who are here for a double dose. I'm impressed at your stamina. And I promise there'll be as little overlap as possible in one or two of the jokes. Okay. So this evening I want to talk about the Heritage Futures Project, but about my fieldwork for the Heritage Futures Project, which is based in the Lake District. So we'll come on to whether the title is suitable by the end, in the usual way of these things. So I want to start with this, which any of you who've heard me speak before have seen this one before. But there you go. It is a plaque at Carisbrooke Castle that English Heritage recently erected. And it expresses gratitude to Mrs. Dorothy Fraser, whose generous bequest has enabled the creation of Princess Beatrice Gardens for future generations to enjoy. Now, when I saw this sign, I was really disappointed because I had hoped to go to the garden myself. Clearly, it's for the future generations and not for me to enjoy. Right? And it's not for us. And this kind of phraseology about doing things for the future is so common in heritage practice that we have come to a point where we don't even notice that we're doing it. And really what the Heritage Futures Project does is take notice of the fact that we're doing it and to take it seriously. Now, there have been people, notably in the States, Dirk Spedeman, who argue that saying that heritage is for the future is really just a rhetorical device that doesn't have any meaning, that it's a get-out clause to avoid actually having to make a real argument as to why we give value to society today. And, you know, that feels like a nice, critical, satisfying statement, but I don't think it really accounts for the sincerity with which people conduct their practice. I think that most people who work in the heritage sector do so because they really do want to make a difference. And most of them do believe that some of that difference exists in relation to the future. So in this project, we're trying to take that seriously, say, if heritage is a practice for the future or a future-making practice, what does that mean? And that's what the Heritage Future Project is set up to do. It's a 4-year project. We're halfway through it now, just about the end of our 2nd year. And it's funded by the YOHRS through the Care for the Future program. I have to say, with no disrespect to any of the others in that program, it's one of the few projects in that program that actually looks at the future. The rest of them are largely looking at the past in relation to that assumed benefit for the future. We have 4 different universities working on the project. UCL, where I'm based, Linnaeus, where my co-I is based, that's Cornelius Holtorf, York, though not here, it's social anthropology, Exeter, and Exeter, that's 4. I'm really good at counting the 4 today. Okay, so we have the 4 projects, 4 universities, and 4 themes. As I said a moment ago, what we're trying to do in the project is explore heritage as a future-making practice, as a practice that creates futures and influences futures. It's a comparative-based project, and what we mean by that we'll see in a second when I go through the themes. But we're working with heritage practitioners, both as partners. We have 20 different institutions that are partners in the project, but also then through ethnographic field work in our various field sites. So the 4 themes of the project are uncertainty, which is my own theme, and I'll come on to it in a second. And I do have a slide for this time, for those of you this afternoon. Transformation, which is the theme that's based here at York through social anthropology. No, sorry, that's one based in Exeter through geography. That's comparing how change is allowed and managed in natural heritage management and cultural heritage management, and looking at how processes of decay, ruination, sea level rise, those kinds of things have different kinds of perspectives from the different domains of practice. Profusion is the one that's based here, and that's looking at how we select from the mass of things that exist in the world, decide which ones are we going to push forward into the future. And the 2 fields being compared there are small to medium museums, which have a fairly big profusion problem at the moment, and people in their homes, so domestic management of profusion, decluttering and other kinds of practices like that, and seeing how those 2 different kinds of things illuminate each other. And then finally, diversity looks at the systems and structures we have for categorizing and managing diversity within cultural and natural heritage. The domains of practice that we're looking at here are things, genetic banks, things like seed banks, and frozen zoos, and how they maintain the concepts of diversity. And comparing that with things, from cultural heritage, the prime one of that is the Endangered Languages program based out of SOAS, and sort of looking at the ways in which their different categorization practices create worlds, do this future making. So to go back to the uncertainty theme essentially deals with the deep future and the uncertainty that it creates. Sometimes people get a little nervous, especially since I use the hashtag uncertainty when I'm saying that something I'm looking at is on Twitter relates to our theme. People go, oh, it's not uncertain. We really are doing good research. We don't mean uncertainty in any kind of critical, in the sense of being negative fashion. Simply that whenever you deal with the future, uncertainty is there. We don't know what is going to happen. There is no certainty to it. And as time goes by, the sense of that uncertainty increases, so that when you deal with periods that come up towards forever, there's very little that you can say with certainty. However, we still need to act in the present in relation to that. So that's what our theme is looking at, is how is that uncertainty managed in the practice that we have today? And we compare 3 different domains. The first is World Heritage Site management, which is regularly assumed to be managed in perpetuity, and so has one version of forever. The second is nuclear waste management, which has we have a responsibility to care for it for 100,000 years, which is the period at which it will still be dangerous to living beings. So that's a different kind of forever. And then the third is deep space messaging. This is the practice people have of sending messages out beyond the solar system with an audience to be assumed after the death of humanity. So those are 3 forevers, and they're pretty different forevers. What we're hoping is by looking at the practices that people engage in around those domains, that we'll understand them better, and will also help people working in those a bit better. And we've had some advances on that so far, so I'll get into those later. So the challenge, and what I really want to speak to you about today, is what does that mean in terms of empirical research? That's all quite interesting ideas. They're all very big ideas, but how does that actually translate into fieldwork? When I say that I'm doing fieldwork in the Lake District, what does that mean? This is Ennerdale Water, which is on the eastern section of the Lake District, and it's also coincidentally was the last site that was considered to be a geological repository for nuclear waste in England, and also is a dark skies reserve, which means an area that has been managed to keep levels of light pollution low. So they have public astronomy going on in this place as well. So strangely enough, this little picture has all three domains embedded within it. But just taking a picture of the lake or even spending time on the lake, recording the lake, any of those things isn't necessarily going to get at the kinds of things that I'm interested in. So, I mean, here is a bench that I was sitting on that while I took that photograph, and it's got because it's a bench in England, therefore it is a memorial bench, because most benches in England are memorial benches. And you know, they don't have them in Sweden. It's quite interesting. They don't have any in Sweden. We have them everywhere here. This one is for Tony Codd, who died in 2000, and it says, "Who found freedom in this place, rest a while and be free forever." So some of my practice as a contemporary archaeologist has been going around looking for things that refer to the topics that we're looking at. And so here's something where we could say, okay, so this is some notion of forever. And there is a notion that sits in the Lake District about stillness and freedom and those kinds of ideas that gets attached to some notion of forever as timeless. But it doesn't really take us very far. And in many ways, it just brings us back to the cultural preconceptions that we might have come to the Lake District with. So I want to get beyond the rest a while and be free forever notion. I have to interrogate it a little more closely. So what other kinds of things might we see that were signs of the future? I'm afraid this one has the color tones on this screen are not quite what I have on my own screen, so I can't see. But you may be able to see this says path corner. And you'll all have seen this kind of this thing before, spray painting on the ground. They're imminent futures. It is not at the moment a path corner. It will be a path corner. And if you walk anywhere in the Western world, you will see this kind of future put in there. But it doesn't help me with the deep future very much, but it does get at this notion that there are things that we put in the landscape today that give us an understanding of what people's intentionality are and how we manage that intentionality in a physical sense. And of course, that little path corner in someone else's mind is this lovely image of how something may be. It's a redevelopment, right? Here we're not, when you look at the path corner, you see a path that's all muddy and broken up, but it's got the path corner. It's going to become this lovely redeveloped space, yeah? And this is another kind of practice that people have in terms of creating futures. They create this imaginary space of what it will be. But these pictures never have this in it. And this I actually took right on the way in here. This is the shabbiness of the reality of what happens as places develop. And that shabbiness is precisely what archaeologists are mostly dealing with. Whenever we're dealing with any kind of assessment of any landscape, we're dealing with the realities of how it actually unfolds. And I could give a whole other thing on shabby, which I think is quite an important concept. But those shabby futures I want to be able to capture, as well as that lovely shiny artist's impression. So to do this, I'm going to start with some models of how we might understand the passage of time into the future. And I hope you will forgive the cartoonist's rough language. But aside from the fact that it feels like it is that long until Friday, the key thing about this image for me is two things. One of which is that there is this notion that there is the past on the left, there is the future on the right, and that's how we might go and look about it. We sit in the middle and we turn our heads in either direction. And it's notable that the past shrinks and the future stretches, so that in fact the future is really the continuing present. What we often think of as the future in these kinds of timelines is really just a stretched out version of this week. So that's one model of how time might work. I tend to work in this project more on this model, which is from my colleague Anne Horberg, and it's hopefully coming out soon. So imagine each one of these lines has basically got the T-Rex and the wine on either end of it. In the middle is us now, is any one of you now. And through our practice in the present day, we create a set of pasts, and we're used enough to that concept in heritage practice that we're creating pasts through our practice. And at the same time as we create pasts through our practice, we're also creating futures. Now, that multiplicity of futures is both individual, but also each individual is doing their own. So it's not really reasonable to expect that we can go off along one of these lines of prediction, because every time you go off along one of these lines of prediction, you're going to end up with another present point. So in fact, the actual sense of how that works out in the world is more like a set of fireworks displays rather than a single line. Now, that could leave us in a situation where it means we can say nothing. And to a certain extent, in relation to the theme uncertainty, the reason I want to really make a point about this is because we aren't doing predictions. A lot of times people think in this project that we're thinking what will happen. We're trying to say something what will happen. And nor are we setting out what we think should happen. When we talk about heritage futures, a lot of people think we must be talking about improving practice. This is not, although we hope to improve practice for the people who are doing their work, that's something that they will do through their own process. We're not putting a future that they should go on. What we're doing is we're looking at this point. As anybody ever is, we're looking at what we have in the present day. Now, those present days don't always come off, and you can never be sure when that's going to happen. So this is a photograph from the gift shop at Mauna Kea on the island Hawaii, where there is a stalled plan to build a large telescope called the 30-meter telescope, or TMT. You can see 30-meter telescope. And they have mugs for sale. However, it's stalled because Mauna Kea is a sacred mountain to the people of Hawaii, and they have mounted a successful campaign to say that the 30-meter telescope is one too many telescopes, and their campaign TMT stands for too many telescopes, not for a 30-meter telescope. And at the moment, it's really uncertain whether the 30-meter telescope will ever be built. That doesn't mean to say that we haven't already got the mugs for it. We can already have the souvenirs of something that does not yet exist. And it's quite interesting in that space, in that that these are just there in the gift shop. There's no other information about the telescope there. They're there in the gift shop. So these kinds of, sometimes we get futures that are imagined and start, but they don't necessarily come to pass. Sometimes they might be imagined in one way and come in another way. But even the process of doing something like making a mug does something which is about your intention. The mug is a bit like that spray painted mark on the ground. The other thing that's useful to think about is the kinds of changes that we might like to think about. This is an ad for a bank. Has all sorts of statements about the future, but this one, in the future, nature and technology will work as one. And I don't know if you can see, but the little bee in this picture has cameras for eyes. So it refers to the ways in which they imagine a technological future will integrate with a contemporary present. And of course, it's not just bees, which may be interfered with in such ways, but there's a whole series of futurist imaginings under the headings of posthumanism, where we're looking at what kinds of alterations may be made to humanity through these kinds of intentions. The reason I put it here is because it does bring in this concept of the Anthropocene and the idea that that where humans have been one of many actors in the development of the planet so far, that we are becoming a dominant actor now. And that moment, which is very dominant in a lot of discourse at the moment, can lead us to think that we have more control over this future. Yeah, that's one of the jokes I didn't tell that afternoon, but it is a good joke. The idea that somehow the fact that we are influencing things means that we have control over them is a bit absurd, but it's quite dominant in a lot of the kinds of discourse around the future. And although we may see it for what it is when we think about things like putting cameras in bees, it doesn't stop us from thinking that we can do things like holding back sea level change when it comes to managing coastal heritage, for instance, where people want to be able to hold on to things that are going to be going. There's the same kinds of arrogance up here there. And I'll bring another Hawaiian example here. This is the outflow of the Pu'o flow from Hawaii at the moment into the sea. And as you can see, it's creating new land. That's what it's, that's where what all that steam is new land being created. And it reminds us, the reason I have it here is to remind us that, in fact, aside from human control of geological processes are still going on. And the world is still being made. And our notion that it's a fixed place that we then act upon is an unfounded one. And that shows itself in the way that Hawaiian people interact with their heritage. So we go back to that question of the 30-meter telescope. One of the reasons that it's important that the sacred mountain retains its sacredness is because people whose families are connected to that mountain do a ceremony every time a child is born where they bring the umbilical cord of that child to that place. And that makes the connection of that child to that place. And this does relate to this volcanic landscape, because whereas in some societies where the perception of landscape is fixed, you may say, this is my family's home. And you don't necessarily need to do anything about the fact that this is my family's home, because the place stays put and people spin around it. In Hawaii, that connection to place is remade on a regular basis as the place around them moves. And indeed, that also gives a slightly different perspective on notions of heritage continuity. So one of the people that I spoke to about this matter, who was living in the path of this flow, and he was away when it started. And he said at first he was quite anxious and thought he should get home. And then he realized that the way that he put it, because the volcano is perceived of as a goddess, he said, if she's coming, she's coming. You know, what he meant was that this is just part of life, that his home may be engulfed in volcanic ash, but that is that he wouldn't expect it to be any other way. And that once he'd come back to this notion that actually the volcano was the thing that was doing the deciding and not him, then he calmed down and didn't need to worry about rushing home. So these notions about who's in control and how much can we actually say anything about the future is very variable. And the way that we have it is part of our practice. Okay, so we go back to the lakes, or start at the lakes. As I said, all three aspects of our uncertainty theme are present in some form or another. It is a candidate World Heritage Site. And it is then alongside what is called the energy coast being a term for where they've put most of the nuclear activity, and including the low-level waste repository, and as I said, the notions for the geological repository, though that is now in abeyance. We'll come back to it in a bit. And then this Dark Skies Reserve, which gives us some information on the deep space messaging as well. So when I first went to the Lake District, I came across two heritage sites that gave me two models for how people might perceive of the future and perceive it in their practice. So here is a site from the Peter Rabbit's Garden experience in Bowness, where there is a general heritage center of the Beatrice Potter books, and where there is also a garden. And the garden is a heritage seed bank registered garden for growing the long scarlet radish, which is the radish that Peter Rabbit is eating in this picture here. And what they do is they plant this seed every year in the same conditions, and therefore they breed it true, and so that the line of the long scarlet radish maintains itself. And that's the practice by which they push the long scarlet radish into the future, through a regular process, not unlike the bringing back of umbilical cords, in the sense that it needs to be done and done again and done again. So that's one model for how the future may be made. And the other one is here about the red squirrels, which again is another great Beatrice Potter animal, but we can move that aside. And I don't know if you can read this. It says here, "Make the future safe for our red squirrels." Right now, I'm not that. If I had something I was going to make the future safe for red squirrels, wouldn't be it, but it is for the people who are running this thing. And this comes back to something that has a number of kind of relatively high-level statements about it, but for me comes very much back to this image, the big yellow taxi image, which is, for me, a reference to Joni Mitchell and the notion you don't know what you've got till it's gone, right? So the way in which things become valuable because they are endangered, right? So the red squirrel is valuable because it is endangered. And so the future is an endangerment of the red squirrel. We may have a future in which the red squirrel isn't safe. That is a future that's coming rushing towards us, and we need to protect against that. So that's a different kind of model of how we might imagine the future and how we might create that future. The endangerment model, as I say, an awful lot of people have written about it, and it's a pretty heavily dominant model in how heritage creates futures. But it isn't the only one, as we'll see as we go through. The other substantial practice that I want to look at in the Lake District is around fell shepherding, because that is the cultural practice for which it is being considered as a World Heritage Site, because it is now having been sent first as a natural landscape and been told it wasn't natural enough, and then being sent as a cultural heritage site and being told it wasn't cultural enough. They now come back and gone for a cultural landscape. And the cultural landscape is the creation of that landscape through the practice of fell shepherding, which has been celebrated at least since the time of Wordsworth, and has had a substantial effect on the whole geomorphology of the area. And one of the pieces of work that I'm doing is working with shepherds and looking at their understanding of what they're doing about the future, their understandings of the future, their understandings of their place in that future. So in this case, this is a man who is actually, the person who tweets as Herbert Shepherd is actually James Rebank, who is a heritage consultant, an international heritage consultant. But he actually would prefer to be a shepherd, as far as I can tell, and has put more effort into shepherding and less effort into consulting over the last little while. And he says, "Two fine ewe lambs, someday these will be the queens of the Lakeland fells." So instantly, whenever we're thinking about lambing, whenever we're thinking about herds and the ways in which herds are managed against characteristics, there's a cross-cutting theme here with our diversity theme there, about the ways in which we say this is a Herbert sheep and this is a rough fell sheep and this one is a different kind of sheep, and how we maintain that diversity. But that is a future-making practice that shepherds engage in. And I've been, as I said, with them. These are rough fell sheep, not Herbert sheep. Any of you who are sheep nerds will instantly be able to tell the difference. And it's a pretty fine-grained practice that shepherds are involved in when they're doing this kind of thing, because they're looking at sheep as they care for sheep throughout the year in order to determine what characteristics those sheep have and what breeding patterns they should have. So it's this very intentional focus through to create this thing that's in the future. Not the kind of distant future that I might be thinking of, but it's a future-making practice that leads them to have a particular attachment to that place. Now, that comes into contrast with this statement that it is the Lake District is the most depressing landscape in Europe. Now, the person who said this is George Monbiot. George Monbiot maintains that the Lake District is the most depressing landscape in Europe because it has been, as he puts it, sheep-wrecked. That the dominance of fell shepherding has reduced the biodiversity of the area, and that has degraded the soils, and that open landscape that so many people claim to love is in fact very depressing and something that we should work against. Now, obviously, the shepherds that I'm working with really resist this notion quite strongly. However, it is an idea that gains traction, the notion of rewilding, the notion of pulling land out of its productive use for humans into a productive use for biodiversity. It's particularly complicated in the Lake District because of the fact that, in fact, none of those sheep make a profit at all, which is why James Rebank is also a heritage consultant and also an author, and why the woman that I do my work with also runs a holiday cottage and is also an author and does any number of things she can to prop up these sheep. And of course, one of the main ways they've been propping up the sheep is through EU subsidy. So these are the kinds of things we can't necessarily expect, but what will the loss of EU subsidy mean for shepherding in the Lake District? A different kind of future. Suddenly the rewilding looks like more an easier option for some people. So the questions of rewilding are high in people's minds, and it has led to disagreement with the National Trust, who are the largest landowner in the Lake District, because they actually have some designs. They're a little cagey about how much designs they have to engage in some rewilding, which would, of course, undermine the World Heritage Site nomination, which is far advanced now. Because if it's designated as a World Heritage Site for fell shepherding, and then you stop fell shepherding, then it'd be put on heritage at risk, and there's all these kinds of anxieties around there. So what does turning it to a World Heritage Site do to the kinds of practices and the ways those create futures? And does that long-term, in perpetuity future that World Heritage purports to work with, how does that work with these kinds of, I want my lambs, my sheep to have lambs, where's the subsidy coming from, should we keep things moving? And this also, for the National Trust, it also relates to, not surprisingly, lakes. The Lake District does have something to do with lakes, even if it's not only about lakes. And this here is actually are photographs from Cromwell Reservoir, which is one of the things that looks like a lake on a map, but is immediately obviously not a lake when you get there. And it is in fact a reservoir for the city of Manchester. And the water from Cromwell is piped through Windermere down to Manchester, and is still one of the main sources of fresh water for Manchester. So the Lake District's drainage is heavily constructed. Whatever any people's perception of it being a wild space, it currently is not a wild space at all, and it's not just the sheep that are keeping it that way. And that issue of water became much more active last winter when the flooding happened that took out bridges and roads and left valleys underwater for quite some period of time. And some of the reason for this is, of course, climate change, which, as we said, we don't have much control over, but some of which is also to do with the fact that the drainage system, as was put in place in the 18th century, is beginning to get creaky. And the National Trust don't want to have to rebuild it because they don't have the money to rebuild it. It's across a whole landscape. So then we may say, okay, the cultural landscape that's being protected is for these sheep, and that's easy, we just keep sheep on it. But there's actually another whole set of infrastructure that goes with it to make that work. And is there the political will, is there resource to maintain it in that shape? Or is a rewilding of rivers, which is a little bit different from some of the notions of rewilding that people have, more likely to be a future that falls out? So we've got different heritage agencies pulling in different directions for different kinds of futures for this place in that. Now, again, go back. The next one then is this energy coast. So that's even within the context of the national park and what would be the World Heritage Site. Now, immediately, whenever you look at that, you say, well, why does it go there? You know, why isn't it going down to the coast? And it's not going down to the coast so that it can avoid the industrialized, and particularly the nuclear industrialized landscape that's down there. But that doesn't mean to say that this isn't really part of the same kinds of practices, though it is interesting how well these boundaries, which have no physical expression on the ground, actually work to change people's understanding and therefore practice and future making. Because if you go to any of the heritage attractions here and ask them about anything to do with the nuclear material here, not only do they not want to talk about it, that's one thing, but they actually don't really know anything about it. They managed to put a somebody else's problem field around it quite nicely. And similarly, people on the coast have little to do with the World Heritage Site nomination that's on the other side of the hills from them. So it's, in terms of practices, this business of drawing boundaries and setting up arrangements and those kinds of practices actually has real world effects as well. So this is the closest photograph I could take of Sellafield, though I've been to Sellafield a couple of times in relation to the work, because you can't take any photographs in Sellafield. And this is one of the things that's quite important in relation to understanding how we might deal with it in the long-term future. Because the reason that we got involved in nuclear waste management in the first place in this project was because the Swedish Nuclear Waste Authority, SKB, approached us because they were content that they could keep the material safe for 100,000 years. But they weren't content that they would be able to keep people out of it for 100,000 years, because they realized that after some time, people wouldn't know what it was. And then if you had human intrusion, that was the greatest danger that would happen. So they came to us and said, you know a lot about 100,000 years ago. How did you find out about 100,000 years ago? To which our response was, well, we don't know that very much about 100,000 years ago. But that doesn't mean to say we weren't willing to take on the challenge of trying to work out about how those kinds of information about things and people might travel through time. But one of the things that we've been working on that part of the project before we started this main project, and one of the things that we've come to there is that this very secrecy is one of the things that will stop information flowing. Hardly surprisingly, secrecy stops information flow. What a surprise. But the nuclear industry needs to know this, right? Because they've thought of all sorts of things, including everything as mad as priesthoods, for how we might pass on this information to future generations. But they are still saying that we will hold the information in a single location, which is actually only available to a few people. And that notion of the priesthood really gives you some idea of what they're thinking about. So one of the things that we can already improve their practice by is by encouraging them to say, well, you know, actually what you need to do is engage with people like Heritage does, yeah? And that the more information you get out there, the more information that everybody knows where the nuclear waste is now, then there's some chance that people may know, some people may know it, the next generation, etc. So that's one of the things. Now, in relation to that, this is a lump of Nyrex glass. It doesn't have nuclear waste embedded in it, but if it did have nuclear waste embedded in it, that would be the approximately amount of Nyrex glass that came through my energy usage in my lifetime. That would be the amount of nuclear waste that had been generated through my energy usage. So it doesn't seem like an awful lot, but a fair number of people, and it ends up being quite a lot. So this question, one of the reasons I'm including it here is, again, this business of sometimes when I've shown this photograph, people have been quite shocked at the idea of holding something that's associated with nuclear materials in their hand. Now, of course, as I say, there isn't any radioactivity in this in its stands, but it's also the case that most of us don't have a hands-on sense of how much waste are we generating through our own electricity usage? How much waste is there to be dealt with? Where is it? What does it look like? What are the problems that are associated with it? So some of the ways in which actually making the future safe for red squirrels or for anybody else involves in trying to make these materials and these practices something that are more well understood by the general public. And that's a large part of what the nuclear industry is keen to do at this point, certainly in Sweden, but even here in the UK, where we're going into a new round of looking for a place for a geological repository. This is then a image from the display that Sellafield is running in Whitehaven in the Beacon Museum. And I'm sorry for the blur on it, the dark, it's quite a dark area. But it's a project where it's a children's activity where they're to build something that would contain these red balls, the red balls referencing nuclear waste. And this is something I think is quite interesting for heritage, is think about how you will demolish your building. Where will all the pieces go? Because one of the real problems that Sellafield had is when they built Sellafield, they never thought about taking it down. And now that it's going to be decommissioned, they have to take it down, and everything that's involved in those buildings is contaminated, and so it needs to be managed in a certain way. They never built it to take it apart again. So one of the things that's interesting in terms of heritage and what heritage gets out of this notion is that it makes us think about the end stages of the things that we deal with, and how things will come to an end. And it gives us that different perspective. Now, the other thing that relates it back to heritage is this notion. This is what's referred to as a gift trunk, which is a poison cabinet. And there are ways in which that heritage has poisonous aspects other than nuclear waste. So this, for instance, is Adolf Hitler's birthplace, which Austria doesn't know what to do with. It's a poison that they need to work out how can they manage, right? And there have been concerns about it being used by neo-Nazis as a site of veneration. There have been suggestions that it should be demolished. Again, how would we demolish it? These kinds of questions of what do we do with the things that we don't want? And again, that's a crossover to that profusion theme that I talked about. Not everything that we have do we want, and some of them can be quite dangerous, but not necessarily valuable to simply demolish them. This is Cromwell Street in Bristol, the site of Fred and Rosemary West's multiple murders, where they buried people in their garden. And you can see it was a terrace house. And in order to try and get rid of that poison, they took out the house and left this space. When they did so, people souvenired pieces of it, because people's desire to be in contact with those kinds of things is quite great. And although it is now some kind of a parkish affair, and they've tried to work it into the system, it's really not working very well. So these questions about how to deal with the things that we don't want are questions that heritage has to deal with too. So we're hoping that our work with the nuclear waste management domain will also help us address some of those questions too. The last bit then is in relation to the deep space messages. This is an image you may or may not recognize. It's an image of what's called sometimes the golden record, which is on the Voyager spacecraft as it goes out beyond the solar system. And the golden record, this is actually the case of the golden record. The golden record itself is actually like an LP. It's about the size of an LP, but it's made of gold, and it contains on it sounds and images of Earth chosen by a group of 6 men in California in 1970. Okay, so it's doing something that heritage does all the time. It scoops up some stuff, right? These things are things that represent us, and it pushes them off into the future. Now, in this case, it pushes them off with a little nuclear-powered engine behind it, but it has similar kinds of conceptual things that we're doing as well. Now, in this case, there's a big effort's been made so that this message may be comprehensible to an alien species that finds it. And you think to yourself, this is even more absurd than the notion of that we're going to keep the nuclear waste safe for 100,000 years, or even more absurd than that we can keep the Lake District as a fell shepherding thing in perpetuity. But again, what I'm trying to work on in this project is the sincerity of this practice. So the image that's here is instructions, and the instructions, and you can see the little cartridge here that looks like someone's going to play this as a record, right? So there's an explanation that goes around, and then here's this thing. And also, although it's cut off in this picture, just because of the way the picture came, it also shows us the base state of hydrogen that's a measurement unit both of time and of space for said spacefaring aliens. The theory behind it is that anyone who is in space would have enough of an understanding of physics to be able to understand the base state of hydrogen, and from that they could work up to all these other things. Okay, so the reason that this is anything other than absurdity is because we do this kind of thing all the time. We lay things out and we think and we hope that someone will be able to understand why we did that. And the question of how much of the intentionality is lost extends when we think about the future, but it's still something that, the deep future, but it's something that's still useful when we're thinking about it in more proximal ways. Here's some of the stuff that's on that. It's not all things that you might think of as the most beautiful things, although it does have some of the most beautiful things. This is one of the images, which is clearly of traffic. They felt this was something that was an important part of their experience that they would want to share with someone else. The question then of how do we bridge that communication, but how is it that we're going to choose the things that we put on is something that we are interested in. One of the guys from the 6 guys in California, a man named John Lomberg, an artist, is one of our partners. And he now is doing another project called the One Earth Message, which is crowdsourcing another message to upload to the New Horizons spacecraft before it goes. So we're interested in looking and working with him to understand what kinds of things people do with that crowdsourcing, what kinds of images, how they go through selection processes, how the One Earth project itself makes a selection from the things that are sent in, and how that's conceived of as a message. So we're working with him on those issues. But as I say, I also want to bring it back to the lakes. How can I bring deep space messaging to the lakes? I'm always trying to get myself back there. Well, this is the Lower Gillerthwaite Field Centre, which is in the Dark Skies Reserve in Ennerdale. And they run regular public astronomy functions. So here, in a place that is as far away from California as anywhere else, is a place where the notion of deep space is being activated as a public heritage. Now, of course, Lake District is dark skies for a number of reasons, one of which is that in this particular case there's not very many streetlights, and the other reason is because it's raining an awful lot. So here we have an essential part of stargazing equipment for England, which is an umbrella. There's not very many places where you go stargazing with an umbrella, but they have thought about very hands-on ways in which they can engage even quite young people with the quite complex notions of astronomy. So these are constellations, which are the boy who is my son in question, have put on in little glow-in-the-dark stars. When I went to this stargazing event in the early part of this year, last year, I was really struck by the incredibly good engagement practice that the astronomers working at this place had. You know, we rocked up to that farmyard in the middle of nowhere just before the whole thing started, because we raced across the countryside as one does. And they were, with very low tech, able to engage even everyone in the room with the concepts that they were involved in. And some of that was through this notion of really their deep passion for the material. And some of it was because of the emotional connection that people have to the idea of stargazing and the people who would come. So they took this, what you might think of as a very high-tech kind of thing, astrophysics, and they made it something that was incredibly accessible. And certainly as a heritage practitioner, I felt quite humbled, because I thought, we think we do engagement well, but in fact we've got an awful lot to learn from the way that astronomers and space scientists do engagement. And in fact, they've been doing an awful lot of very good social media engagement as well. Another time I might talk about some things around the Philae lander and the way that the Philae lander lived through social media and engaged people. So again, there's things back to heritage to understand about astronomy that we can also see. And then some things that I found while I've been in the Lake District have nothing to do with any of my domains at all, but they're still there. This is the symbol for the Lakes Distillery. And it's the best change of use of an existing building or conversion. It's got a lovely little heritage plaque on it, so it's been stamped, right? And the thing is that distilleries need a heritage. You can't have a new distillery. It doesn't work from a branding point of view. And it also doesn't work from the point of view you actually need a period of time where the whiskey matures. You can't even start selling the whiskey until it's had a few years running. So when the people who were running this Lakes Distillery set their business plan up, they absolutely worked heritage into it from the very beginning. So the reason they've got this great best of change of use is they took an old farmyard to make it their distillery centre, and they put distillery tours immediately into it. Before any spirit was actually available for sale, it already had become heritageized before it was actually profitable for the product that it sold. And that heritageization, we can go into that horrible word, also draws on the future. So this here are a tweet they have about a founders club that they founded, where you can buy a cask of their whiskey, which will be stamped with your name. In this case, the Princess Royal has one of these casks. And then when it is ready, she will have the whiskey, but it's also being sold as be a part of whiskey history. So the history is anticipatory, right? You will in the future be part of history by engaging in these kinds of things. And these kinds of small entrepreneurial, deliberate workings with the past and the future are all through the Lake District, and in fact probably all through anywhere you look, but certainly it's a big part of the way in which that practice operates. So I wanted to just draw attention to it here, because sometimes we might think, oh, these big domains, we've got World Heritage Site Management, nuclear waste management, but it's also through those daily practices that may not even, that may fly below the radar of what heritage practice might be. So in relation to all of that, there are many people involved in making deep futures in the Lake District. This is a please stick to the path. Again, great desire for intentionality that is mostly not going to be followed, is it? These people are not always aware when they're making these deep futures that that's what they're doing. And certainly that's something I really came across in relation to the nuclear waste management. The Swedish partners that we have are really, really aware of that 100,000-year lifetime. Whereas most of the people working on nuclear waste in Cumbria are very much focused on the present, because that's where the biggest anxiety is. And so they very rarely talk about the deep future, even when they're talking about their repositories. So sometimes those futures are conflicted and sometimes they're not. So sometimes they can pick up steam and we say, oh, yes, everybody's working towards this same future. But the greatest divergence that I've seen is actually been between heritage agencies. So the people pushing for the World Heritage Site status and the National Trust. I think that's the greatest divergence in what people are actually thinking of. And then I'm starting to be able to see some of these futures in the landscape as revealed by practices. So then, just before I finish up, which I think we're about time to finish up, aren't we? Sorry, I've probably gone well over with the timing. But is back to that question of the sublime. So what does that having that deep future do for people in the Lake District or anywhere else? I think it gives us this sense of perspective and awe that is more and more difficult for people to create through space, through spatial dislocation. And so we create a space in which we may contemplate the things which we can't control, and that the complete lack of control is one of the things that it actually offers as a benefit, and that sense of the sublime. However, the only way that works is if you've got a place to stand. And in many ways, the ways in which we manage heritage as this unmoving concept, in as far as we do, these notions of holding things in perpetuity, is to create that standpoint. And we say, okay, we accept that glaciation may come again, that the death of humanity may come again, but, oh, it may come again, the death of humanity may come. Oh, it's come before, it'll come again. Battlestar Galactica. There you go, different matter. But the heritage and our selection of material that we will say is our heritage is the perspective, the rock on which we're standing as we look out over the sublime of the deep future. So that's enough for now.
Thank you. We have time for a few questions, so I'll open for.
I just would like to hear, Sarah, a little bit more about the thing you alluded to at the end about the greatest divergences being between the heritage agencies and
And it's a difficult one because, of course, these things are being said subtly sometimes, and it's a conflict that I think people are trying not to dive into. So in a way, I don't want to make more of it. But at the same time, if the National Trust is intending to pursue a program of any amount of rewilding, and the National Park is pushing for a designation based on cultural landscape status, it's difficult to see how those two can come together at this point. You know, if it had started some time ago, then they could have said we have this exciting landscape which is a mix of wild and curated. But if we're going to draw that little red line around it and say this is our cultural landscape, then that does fix the kinds of practices that you can engage in, and it makes it more difficult in that sense. So I really don't know what's going to happen with the bid, but I wouldn't be overly surprised if it didn't go through.
Thanks, that's terrific. I'm interested in this idea of boundaries as well, but also the distinction between natural and cultural, and it follows on from that. Because you didn't explicitly refer to that, and I very much like James Rebank's book, A Shepherd's Life. A friend recommended it to me, and he warned me because I'm from the Lake District originally, and he said he makes it very clear at the start that he doesn't like anyone poetic, he doesn't like Wordsworth, he doesn't like Southerners, anyone who's got a degree, basically anyone who's not a fell shepherd in the Lake District. But I said that I very much loved it, but I didn't get the sense in his book either about the difference between the natural and cultural designation, especially when you look at World Heritage sites and the fact that there are so few national parks around the world that recognise both values. So what's your sense of that?
Well, the thing is, I mean, James Rebank is an interesting character, and I would recommend the book. The book's a lovely, lovely book and very beautifully written. And of course, he has a degree and he is lettered, but then he represents himself in this other way. And some of the people I've spoken to in the National Trust talk about the way in which he performs shepherding. You know, he performs shepherding for quite an international audience, and that's one of the things that these cultural landscape designations support and require. Right, a performance of a certain way of life that then is consumed on a world stage. So in some ways, he kind of gets that thing. The cultural landscape designation is an odd one because it isn't. In some ways, it's a thing that allows for the Intangible Heritage Convention to have some nose into the World Heritage Site Convention. And although it should blur the distinctions between natural and cultural heritage, it doesn't as effectively as you might think. And we ran a workshop at the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, this summer, the wider project, on this particular question about nature, culture, heritage, and how they are intertwined and how they need to be managed together. And we got a lot of interesting feedback on that process, but it was very hard to get anyone to talk about the difficulties of that. And yet in almost every country, they're managed by different laws, they have different groups of people working on them, and the ways in which they actually interact, despite the fact that in the real world they interact completely, in our management of them, they're still quite separated out. So I think the cultural landscape designation is kind of a pretty imperfect way of trying to bridge that gap.
Any questions? Yeah.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks. I really, really love that. I think, and I don't want to kind of force you to talk about kind of instrumentality of your research, but you stressed quite a few times about highlighting that these practices, the people who engage in them are really sincere, operating within their stage. And that when we sit here and think about them in terms of distant futures, that they become absurd. And so, and you talked about how the Heritage Futures Project isn't about dictating futures or predicting futures, but about looking at uncertainty in the present. And I suppose I'm wondering how do you hope your research will influence how people work with these uncertainty practices in the present? I'm assuming you're not hoping that they'll realize they're absurd.
No, I don't want them to give up and go home. I really don't. I mean, particularly the people managing nuclear waste, I really don't want them to give up and go home. We need them to have that sincerity, and we need all of the people doing these kinds of practices to have this sincerity. What I hope is that they will have that space for reflection and co-reflection with each other. So I do hope that people will become more thoughtful when they use the word the future, and particularly in heritage. A number of people said to me when I started this project, oh, it'll be really good you doing this work with the nuclear waste people because you'll be able to teach them about the importance of the future. Guess what? They've thought about it much more than we have, a lot more than we have. So if we can get heritage people to be more aware of how much more thinking there is to be done, and to come into contact with other people who've thought about it, and to decide how much are we sincere, how much is the future the thing that we really care about. And I think there are aspects where heritage really does care about the future, and there are other aspects where heritage really cares about today. And if we can pull back and say, these are the ones, we're not doing this for the future, we're doing this for now. And these are the things that are actually really important to us in terms of future making. And we can sort of straighten that out a little bit from a heritage practice point of view. That would be quite good, you know.
I had a question that was kind of like Harold's, but I don't know that I can articulate it exactly, because I am interested in how in you being asked to think what archaeologists could contribute to the Swedish agency's planning, how you can then inform archaeologists' interpretations of prehistory, for instance. Like, once you have that question in mind, like when somebody comes to you and says, like, what can you tell us that will help us to plan for 100,000 years from now, that cannot then also be reapplied to archaeology? And like, are there tips that you can give? Okay. I mean, I guess I just wonder if there's a way that it can have another impact in terms of forcing some, folks to theorize in a different way within the discipline. So I don't know that you can answer that question.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about forcing anybody to do anything, really.
Yeah.
I mean, I know you don't mean it that, but I think that this model of how we might interact. I mean, the perspective. The original title of the project was the Assembling Alternative Futures for Heritage, which we decided was too much of a mouthful. But the reason that it had that title was because the PI of the project, Rodney Harrison, is particularly interested in assemblage theory and in how it might actually is used to understand heritage and archaeology as a heritage practice. And so that notion of the multiple paths that we create in the present is pretty much embedded in the way that we work. Now, that's not necessarily the way that all archaeologists and all heritage practitioners work. And I say it as if it were a commonplace, but I accept that there are archaeologists who believe that they are seeking a true past. That through the proper application of empiricism, they will be able to reconstruct a past that is the real past. And I suppose my question is when we hold that, then how does that relate us to the future? That's kind of where my reflection on that. But realistically, it is a heritage project rather than an archaeology project. I'm an archaeologist and I use some archaeological methodology in the sense of the way that I do field work, but it is large, the benefit should be to the heritage sector in a broader sense, as opposed to archaeology.
Which is what I thought was interesting about it, because the way that I understood it when you described it was in part of the project was like the impetus came from them specifically seeking out archaeologists to talk to inform, so that anyways doesn't really.
No, but that project is, as I say, it was a sort of a project that happened largely. Their original contact was through that project, which they funded in Sweden, and then we've kind of used that as a springboard to investigate the matter in a sort of broader fashion.
I have one other question, which is about you were talking about the astronomers' public engagement, and I wondered if there's, like, are they doing same things that, say, the heritage world is doing, just better? Or are they actually using completely different models of practice that make their work more engaging?
I'm hoping to explore it more. I would say I've done, in terms of actually ethnographic practice with astronomers, I've done 3 bits of field work on that, and so it's still pretty early. I think some of it is simply that they do it better, but the main thing is, and I haven't really gone into it in this talk, but those of you who are here this afternoon, the way in which children are perceived of in heritage is another thing that we're kind of looking at in the project, and the way that they're used. And one of the ways in which both nuclear waste management and heritage use children is as ambassadors. They will be ambassadors for the future. So when we do heritage engagement, quite often what we're trying to do is get children interested, so they will continue to visit sites, so they will grow up to be supportive of heritage, so they will do those things, so they will be ambassadors for us, right? And I didn't notice any of that in any of their practice. When they were dealing with any of the people that they were dealing with, they were not trying to convince them to do anything for them. They were simply sharing what they were doing. Now, as a result of that, those people may well go on to be happier to have money spent on various astronomical things. But the sense of it as, we're going to get you interested in how important it is, was not there. And that's partly because they didn't use this endangerment narrative. Yeah. So it's something I'm still unpicking, but I think the endangerment narrative, while it's a great thing for drawing people in, can also then give people, make your engagement be very much about trying to drive people to do something. But I mean, it was also, some of it was just skill. I mean, there was this guy, and he was doing a session on astrophotography, and he had very beautiful images of nebula, and there was a child, maybe 4 years old, sat on the floor at the front, and she just cut in straight across him, as 4-year-olds will, and said, "What's that in the corner?" Right now, he stopped and he answered her. He looked at her, and he answered her in such a way that both answered her question and also gave lots more information to any adults in the room who mightn't have known what that was in the corner. And he did it totally seamlessly. So some of it is just skill, and it really just made everyone in the room feel comfortable. There was the fact that children and adults were generally dealt with as one group was also quite beneficial. So.
Any final questions? Thank you so much, Sarah. Wonderful talk. Lots of things. We only have one YOHRS seminar left. It's next week. It's on an unusual day, Thursday, the 2nd, because of Jenny Kidd's schedule, and we're looking at ethics and digital stuff, and also Pokemon Go with her, so it'll be interesting. And we're headed to some of us are headed to the pub afterwards, the Eagle and Child, if you want to join and carry on the conversation. Thanks.